Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here again to, well, cut through the noise, pull out those key insights, and hopefully give you that shortcut to feeling truly clued in. Today, we're actually continuing our series on the unconscious. This is the 5th installment, if you've been following along. And we're tackling something pretty profound, Melanie Klein's really radical idea about something she called fantasy, with the PH. So let's unpack this. We're diving into a paper by Rachel B. Blass. It's called Reflections on Klein's Radical Notion of Fantasy and its Implications for Analytic Practice. Quote, our mission, really, is to walk you through Blass's main points. We want to explore how Klein's view of fantasy, which Blass sees as truly expansive, doesn't just tweak things. It fundamentally challenges how we understand unconscious life. And maybe even more crucially, how it shakes up the way we think about psychoanalytic technique, how therapy actually works. It makes you wonder, are minds shaped by forces we barely grasp?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because Blass makes this really strong point. She says, look, lots of analysts might use bits of Klein, maybe ideas about early childhood or envy, that kind of thing. But truly getting on board with her specific idea of unconscious fantasy, that's not just adding another theory. It's transformative. Blass argues it demands a completely different way of doing clinical work. It's not just abstract theory. It's about a whole different kind of relating in the therapy room itself.
Okay, so let's start there then. What exactly is this Kleinian unconscious fantasy? Because Blass seems really keen to clarify it first. She says it's not just any old unconscious stuff like forgotten memories or, wishes we've pushed down. And definitely not fantasy with an F, like making up a story in your head.
Right.
So the unconscious is made of fantasy, but this fantasy, it's defined very differently, more radically.
Yeah, precisely. Blass points to Susan Isaacs, another key figure here, who described fantasy as the mental side of instincts, the stuff bubbling up from the id. But, and this is crucial, it's not a thought like we usually think of thoughts, not words forming a sentence like, oh, I shouldn't feel envious. Blass really emphasizes that fantasy gets at meanings within instinctual experience, but before words. Or without needing words, perhaps. It's not like an experience that's just waiting for language to label it. It is a kind of thinking, the thinking of pre-verbal life, you could say. And this thinking isn't simple. It's incredibly rich and complex. It's about the core stuff, love, hate, survival, and it literally shapes our minds.
Wow, okay, the thinking of pre-verbal experience. That's a big idea. And Blass breaks it down further.
She does. She highlights a few key things. First, the original bodily nature of fantasy. These fantasies start with basic body stuff. Hunger, needing something, feeling pain, the sensation of being fed, digestion, even evacuation.
Right, the really primal feelings.
Exactly. But they aren't just sensations. They're immediately tied to relationships. They're soaked in meaning right from the start. So think about an infant's hunger. It's not just an empty stomach feeling. It's tied up with the experience of the mother being absent, the source of nourishment gone. That absence itself carries huge meaning for the baby, about the world, about the mother, about connection.
So the feeling is the meaning. In a way.
In a fundamental way, yes. Joan Revere described it so vividly. She talked about the hungry infant feeling the mother's absence, almost like death.
Yeah.
It's that intense.
Oh.
And it's all mixed up the need, which is a kind of love, and this overwhelming pain of loss. Revere even said that in babyhood, goodness, pleasure, satisfaction, it's all one sensation, and that deep connection stays with us. These bodily felt meanings are the fantasies. They're like embodied ideas about relationships, about love and hate, pleasure and pain.
Embodied ideas, okay? And Blass quotes Isaacs about destructive impulses too, like tearing to bits.
Right. Isaacs argued the infant doesn't need to know about destruction consciously to have fantasies about it. The impulse itself, the raw bodily feeling, contains that meaning. The baby doesn't need to see something eaten to fantasize destroying the breast when frustrated. Blass puts it beautifully, saying this knowledge is so lived, so alive, that it is in our very bones.
Wow.
When that baby feels intense anger, it knows destruction from the inside. So while therapy uses words later, the fantasies themselves, they're not neat little sentences in the mind.
Okay, this leads to the next really big point, doesn't it? Fantasy as the material of the mind. Not just contents in the mind, but the mind's actual substance.
Exactly. That's the radical shift. It's not like we have a mind container and fantasies are just swimming around inside. The fantasies are the container. They are the structure.
So what does that mean practically? If I have a fantasy about attacking something inside me, like an internalized idea of my mother, say, does that mean a part of my mind is literally damaged?
In a psychic sense, yes. That's the Kleinian view, Blass explains. Changes in fantasy have real, concrete effects on how our mind works, on our ego functioning. Isaac's was very clear. It's not that your mind falls apart and then you interpret that feeling as having dismembered your internal mother. It's the other way around. Because in fantasy, you wanted to dismember the mother. Your ego, your sense of self, your ability to cope feels fragmented.
That sounds bleak, but you mentioned optimism.
Well, yes, because it implies our mental state isn't fixed, it's dynamic. If fantasies are active, motivated states, they can be changed. Even from really withdrawn, psychotic-like states, change is possible if you can reach and modify the underlying fantasy that's driving it, because those fantasies are held for personal reasons, they have motives.
Okay, and Blass also makes a distinction between fantasy and just a wish.
She does. A wish can feed into a fantasy, sure. But the fantasy itself is more complex. It's a whole contemporary, relational, motivated state. It's grounded in a kind of internal story, maybe, about how you relate to your internal objects, and it directly shapes who you are in the moment. It opens up the here and now experience.
Which brings us to the next point. Fantasy is always active, always shaping how we see reality.
Always. If the mind is made of fantasy, then we can't help but see the world through that lens. We live out our fantasies. Isaac's had those great examples we still talk about, taking things in with our ears or devouring with our eyes. For Cline, that's not just metaphor.
It reflects that deep, bodily, personal involvement in how we experience things.
Exactly. Fantasies are the prism. They shape reality for us.
But there is a real reality out there, right? Kleinians aren't saying it's all just in our heads.
No, not at all. Blass is clear on this. There's objective reality. But the Kleinian focus is on reality's meaning for us. It's relational, and importantly, it's moral significance. It's not just seeing the milk bottle. It's understanding the offering of goodness, of love, or maybe suspecting it's poisoned. The problem isn't fantasy itself. It's when fantasy gets rigidly imposed onto reality, blinding us. Like in projective identification.
Right, that idea of unconsciously dumping unwanted feelings onto someone else and then treating them as if they really are that feeling.
Yes. You project your own aggression, say, onto someone, and then you genuinely experience them as persecuting you. The fantasy overrides the reality of the other person. So fantasy is about reality, its nature, how we know it can block us from seeing things clearly.
Okay. And finally, the content of these fantasies. What are they typically about?
Given they stem from instincts and early bodily experience, they're about the big stuff. Life and death, love and hate, envy, greed, feeling dependent, being creative, taking things in, losing things. And a huge one is guilt.
Guilt arising from that conflict between love and hate for the same person.
Exactly. Loving the person you also, in moments of frustration, wanted to destroy in fantasy. That creates immense conflict and guilt. And the raw material comes from the child's actual life. Needing things, being frustrated, bodily functions, parents, siblings, the whole Oedipal drama, it all feeds into these fantasies.
Okay, that gives us a really solid grounding in the concept itself. Now, the really crucial part Blass emphasizes, how does this radical view of fantasy actually change clinical practice? The implications.
Right. This is where it gets really practical and, well, transformative for the analyst. First, Blass tackles the meaning and nature of analytic cure. Freud wrestled with this, didn't he? He thought knowledge cured, but what kind of psychic truth? And how does conscious insight actually change the deep unconscious stuff?
Yeah, that's a classic problem.
Blass argues Klein's idea of fantasy offers a way through. For Klein, the truth that needs to be faced, the denied truth, is unconscious fantasy. These aren't just ideas, they're ideas with instinctual power that shape who we are.
So knowing the truth means integrating these fantasies. How does that happen?
It's not about intellectual understanding, like reading about your fantasies in a book. It's about experiencing them as they come alive again in the transference.
Transference being how the patient relates to the analyst based on past patterns, and in this view, current fantasies.
Exactly. The patient unconsciously replays these fantasied relationships with the analyst. What's denied or projected gets lived out right there in the room. The analyst's job is to see it, understand it, and interpret it. That interpretation allows the patient to experience the fantasy differently, to integrate it, which in turn changes the fantasy itself.
Can you give that example Blass uses? The depressed patient.
Sure. So a patient feels deeply depressed, maybe lives with this pervasive sense of badness. The underlying fantasy might be that they've destroyed their good internal objects, the internal mother, say, and now they deserve this empty, ruined state. In therapy, this comes alive. Maybe the patient initially experiences the analysis itself as boring, dead. That's the fantasy being enacted.
Making the therapy like the ruined internal world.
Right. Then, through interpretation, they might start to see, oh, I'm the one making this boring, I'm ruining it. Then deeper feelings might emerge, the guilt, the fear of their own destructiveness. As they can face that fantasy, the mind can come alive again. Split-off parts get integrated, the world seems more real, the fantasy changes, and maybe the internal objects feel less destroyed, more whole.
And doing this requires that really intense focus only on interpreting fantasy in the transference. Blass mentions Riviere and Kline being quite strict about this.
Very strict. Riviere basically said psychoanalysis is only about the imaginings of the childish mind. And Kline insisted the analyst's role is purely to analyze, to consistently interpret unconscious fantasy as it emerges right there in the relationship. No advice, no educating, no trying to be a good object in other ways, just analysis.
Which naturally leads to this idea of the complex neutral analytic stance. What does that mean in practice? It sounds difficult.
It is incredibly difficult. It means the analyst tries to understand the patient's fantasies without getting drawn into enacting them. Patients inevitably, unconsciously, try to make the analyst into figures from their fantasy world. They'll provoke feelings, make demands, consciously or unconsciously, for love, advice, punishment, reassurance.
Things any normal person would feel pulled to respond to.
Absolutely. The analyst feels those pulls, the urge to soothe, to correct, to punish back sometimes. But the Kleinian stance is, you don't act on it. You restrain yourself. You experience the pull, but you use that feeling to understand the fantasy the patient is trying to communicate or live out through you.
So going back to the patient afraid their anger destroy the analyst. Just saying, don't worry, I'm fine, is enough.
Blass argues it actually gets in the way. It might offer temporary relief, but it doesn't touch the underlying fantasy that their anger is destructive. The patient might then think, oh, the analyst doesn't see how bad I am, or maybe even the analyst is scared of my anger. If the analyst plays the soothing role, they can't properly see or interpret the raw fantasy.
And the patient just projects their belief onto the analyst instead of integrating the feeling.
Exactly. Blass calls it omnipotent projection, taking the place of integration. Even tiny things, a slight shift in tone, a non-committal can be unconsciously seized by the patient as confirmation of their fantasy.
But you said neutrality is an ideal, never fully reached. It doesn't mean being cold or robotic.
Not at all. That's a common misconception. The analyst has to be deeply attuned to their own feelings. Love, hate, confusion, boredom, whatever comes up. But the discipline is to not act on those feelings impulsively, and instead to use them as data. Why am I feeling this now? Is this mine, or is it something the patient is putting into me related to their fantasy?
That reminds me of that Kline quote Blass mentions to the supervisee.
Oh, yes. The supervisee says, my patient put confusion into me, and Kline apparently just replies, no, my dear, you just were confused.
Right. So constant self-scrutiny is needed. Is this my stuff, or is it part of the patient's fantasy being communicated?
Exactly. It requires immense emotional honesty and resilience from the analyst. It's both close feeling the patient's world and distant maintaining the analytic function.
Okay, so that's neutrality. How does this view then shape the understanding of transference itself? It sounds different from just repeating the past.
It is. For Kleinians, transference isn't just replaying actual past relationships, or even past relationships colored by fantasy.
Yeah.
It is the lived expression of fantasied relations happening right now. It's the patient's current, active, motivated state of mind, their unconscious stories playing out with the analyst.
So if a patient feels abandoned by the analyst, the first question isn't who abandoned you in the past, but
How and why are your unconscious fantasies creating this feeling of abandonment right now in this room with me? The focus is on the present psychic reality shaped by fantasy.
And Blass argues that focusing too much on historical facts can actually distract from this.
Yes, it can become a defense against understanding the immediate unconscious fantasies driving the patient's current experience. The analyst isn't just seen as mom or dad. They can be experienced as parts of the patient's own mind, or even fantasied body parts, something being taken in, expelled, attacked, protected. Everything becomes part of the transference.
How the patient hears an interpretation, their silences.
Everything. It's very much a hear-first approach. If a patient talks about neglecting their child, the Kleinian analyst is listening primarily for what the patient is doing to the analyst psychologically by telling the story now. What fantasy is being enacted in the telling?
So, in a way, every interpretation is a transference interpretation.
Essentially, yes, because everything the patient brings is seen as manifesting their current fantasy life as it engages with the analyst and the analytic setting.
Which leads perfectly into the final practical point. How to interpret the transference in this model. Blass says Kleinians agree it should be direct.
Direct. Very direct. And Blass outlines several key features of this directness. One, It's about you and me, here and now. If the patient talks about their boss, the interpretation might be about how they're relating to the analyst, like that boss, right now. Keeps it live.
Okay.
2. Immediately. Yeah. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Fantasies shift and compete for expression. Catch them as they surface.
3. Present tense. It's happening now.
4. Don't argue or try to convince. The goal isn't intellectual agreement. It's to make contact with the living fantasy, to mobilize it.
5. Use your own words. The analyst needs to stay separate, not just parrot the patient, to help understanding. Simple, direct language close to the fantasy's likely experience.
And 6. Solely interlet. No hidden advice, no manipulation, just uncovering the unconscious fantasy in the transference.
Vlask gives some examples, right? The patient talking about colleagues.
Yes. Patient talks dismissively about colleagues, maybe their successes. The analyst, perhaps feeling subtly attacked or dismissed herself, interprets the attack as being directed at her, the analyst, in that moment.
And then the patient becomes apathetic.
Right. The analyst then interprets that shift. Perhaps feeling the impact of their attack, the patient became overwhelmed by guilt and fear of losing the analyst. So, unable to bear it, they turn the aggression inwards, shutting down parts of themselves, hence the apathy. Kline interpreted this, and the patient felt it, became emotional, depressed, but more integrated, even hungry.
Wow. And the other example, Dana and the leaky house.
Yeah, that's a great one. Dana complains endlessly about leaks in her house, blaming the seller. Her previous analyst linked it to childhood rivalry. But Blas, listening, felt it was Dana's own mind that had hidden cracks, letting unwelcome thoughts leak in. The damage was internal, but experienced as external, projected onto the house and cellar.
So the analyst tried to interpret that directly.
Yes, eventually. Dana resisted, told her to drop it, but then immediately told a story about a violent ex-boyfriend she couldn't get rid of, and the analyst came to see that story as Dana's unconscious way of describing her relationship with a violent, persecuting part of herself that she felt stuck with the very thing leaking through.
That really shows the layers and the focus on the here and now meaning, even in seemingly unrelated stories.
Exactly. Though Blas does note variations among Kleinians, too.
Although, like what?
Subtle differences in focus. Some might emphasize how the analyst is seen by the patient. Others, like Betty Joseph, focus more on how the patient is trying to make the analyst feel or act those "you would like me to believe that" interpretations.
Yeah.
Fantasies are complex, multi-layered, so different interpretations might be valid at different times. Also, the language some modern Kleinians might be less concrete, but Blas argues that sometimes those really direct bodily interpretations.
The ones that sound maybe a bit shocking.
Perhaps. But they can create that live contact with the raw fantasy. She quotes Hannah Segal telling someone facing a very disturbed patient to interpret in a concrete, bodily way, saying something like, "Don't worry, she's psychotic, she'll understand." Meaning that language resonates with the primitive level of the fantasy.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive into Blas's take on Kline really underscores how radical this view of fantasy is.
It absolutely does. It's such a profound shift from seeing fantasies as just thoughts or wishes to seeing them as the very fabric of the mind, always active, always lived out, especially in that intense relationship with the analyst.
And the implications for practice are huge. That firm, neutral stance, the direct interpretation solely focused on the transference. It sounds demanding, maybe even harsh to some.
Blas addresses that. She argues it's firm, not harsh. It requires an incredible amount from the analyst, the ability to withstand these powerful unconscious forces from the patient, the projections, the attacks, without collapsing or retaliating. But it's that very firmness, that refusal to collude with the fantasy that allows for a different kind of healing process, one that happens at that deep fantasy level of the mind.
So a final thought then, for you listening. If Blas is right, if Kline was right, and our unconscious fantasies truly are the material our minds are made of, shaping how we see everything, how we live, what would it really mean to know them? Not just intellectually, but as Blas says, in our very bones. How might really grappling with that change how you experience your own reality?
Something to think about.
Definitely something to chew on. Keep exploring, keep questioning. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.